Well, welcome everybody to this evening's webinar, Advancing Whole Person Health, looking at the mind, heart and gut. We're excited with the presentation this evening and look forward to being able to not only present but answer some of the questions. Well, it's three presenters this evening. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw will be dealing with the heart, Dr. Andrew Pennington will be dealing with the gut, and then myself, Associate Professor Ross Grant, will come on at the end and we'll tie it all together. First, let's just an acknowledgement of country. So on behalf of the Sydney Adventist Hospital, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Adventist Healthcare acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. The Adventist Healthcare Limited would like to pay their respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. HCL also recognises the continuing contribution that the Darug people make to the life of this region, and pray that we can work together to leave a legacy of reconciliation, justice and hope for all future Australians. A couple of housekeeping rules for the webinar this evening. Your microphones and videos will be turned off, and that'll happen by default. You may ask questions at any time via the Q&A module. Please don't ask questions into the chat windows. Use the Q&A module. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we can, but please note that this webinar is also being recorded, and the audience will remain anonymous at all times, so if you do ask a question, you won't be identified. Mobile phones and devices may need to move the floating thumbnail, that's just as the Adventist Healthcare logo, to the bottom of the screen so it doesn't cover the speaker video. So the SAN, Sydney Adventist Hospital, since we first opened our doors back in 1903, almost 120 years ago, it opened as the Sydney Sanitarium and therefore became affectionately known as the SAN, and it's been committed to helping improve the well-being of the whole person, patient, staff and community members. Dr. Shaw will be giving our first presentation on the heart. And Dr. Shaw is a structural and interventional cardiologist at Sydney Adventist Hospital and Northern Beaches Hospital. She's staff specialist in cardiology at Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Hospital and Director of Shaw Cardiology and lecturer at the University of Sydney.
Thank you, Ross. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Shaw. I'm a structural and interventional cardiologist, and I'm the head of department at the Sydney Adventist Hospital for Cardiology. I also work at Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Hospital and Northern Beaches Hospital, and my private rooms are at Shaw Cardiology, which are at the SAN Clinic at here in Wahroonga. So my talk is on heart health, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about coronary artery disease and heart attacks, and then talk about some of the symptoms of heart attacks, and then the importance of heart health. Then I'll be focusing on some of the risk factors of coronary artery disease and finishing up on investigations for coronary heart disease, as well as the importance of a heart health check. So coronary artery disease and a heart attack is a very serious condition. It results when there's a narrowing or blockage of the arteries that supply blood to your heart. It's usually caused by a buildup of plaque, which is made up of fatty deposits of cholesterol in the wall arteries. If a blockage occurs, it's from the cessation of blood flow, and then you can have a severe heart attack, which can be life-threatening. The most common form of heart disease in Australia is coronary artery disease. Now, an acute myocardial infarction is a medical term for a heart attack, and it is a medical emergency. It's a sudden stop of blood to the heart. And the blood is really important for the heart as a muscle because it carries oxygen to help the heart function. Now, when there's a lack of oxygen, the heart muscle begins to die. And the important thing is getting to the hospital as quick as you can, because it can reduce the damage to your heart and it increases your chances of surviving the heart attack. Now, people often ask, do heart attacks always involve some kind of pain? Most people know that, left-sided central crushing chest pain is a sign of a heart attack. However, there are other signs that I'll go through shortly. And it is important to remember that women are more likely to experience other symptoms than the traditional chest pain. And important to remember also that if you have pain that lasts more than 10 minutes, it's really important to take action immediately. Too many people delay seeking treatment, which can have detrimental effects to their heart. Now, knowing the warning signs could really save your life. And a heart attack isn't always chest pain. You could experience pain in a number of places, including your jaw, where you can feel an ache or tightness around your lower jaw on one or both sides, which can spread from your chest to your jaw. You can also experience pain in your neck, or some people describe it as a choking sensation or burning sensation in their throat. Some people get pain in their back, upper back in particular, between their shoulder blades. They may also experience pain in their shoulders. They may also get pain in their arms, which may or may not be associated with chest pain. They may also have some tingling sensations or numbness down their arm. Sometimes there is no pain at all, in particular in patients with diabetes, where they have something called a silent heart attack, where they have a heart attack with no pain at all. They may experience dizziness. You may experience a cold sweat. You may also have nausea and even vomiting associated with the heart attack. And commonly, you may also experience shortness of breath, where you have trouble taking a deep breath or feeling like a sensation of a band or pressure constricting your chest and stopping you from taking a deep breath. Now, we all know that as you get older, your risk of heart attacks or heart disease increases, but these risk factors start accumulating in your 20s. And so heart health is really important for young people also. Smoking and the use of oral contraceptive pill can increase blood clots and increase the risk of heart disease and stroke, in particular in people with a family history. 3 to 5% of pregnancies may involve vascular complications that lead to increased risk. And women with males as well with congenital heart disease are now surviving into adulthood. And so it's important to know their heart health and their risks. Now, I wanted to focus a little bit about pregnancy and heart disease. Now, up to 10 to 15% of pregnancies are associated with high blood pressure. And in Australia, 30,000 women each year develop high blood pressure in pregnancy. And 10 to 15% of pregnant Australian women will develop gestational diabetes, which is associated with increased risk of them developing type 2 diabetes later in life. Now, we say pregnancy is the ultimate stress test for the heart. There's an increased load placed on the heart of up to 30 to 50%. And it's important to remember that women with pre-existing heart conditions or those with risk factors like high blood pressure or obesity or diabetes have the heart health monitored throughout pregnancy and in the years that follow. Women who have vascular complications in pregnancy are at much higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease later in their life. For example, women that have preeclampsia or gestational hypertension, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, are at increased risk of having high blood pressure and heart disease. So 10 or 15 years later, their risk of having high blood pressure is double that of the general population and is 4 times greater than women who did not experience these conditions during pregnancy. Now, there are lots of risk factors for heart disease, and those that we can't change include increasing age and a family history. I always say you can't pick your biological parents, unfortunately, sometimes. You can't change your gender and your pregnancy history. Now, there are risk factors we can manage, and these include poorly controlled diabetes, where you have high blood sugars, elevated blood pressure, smoking, obesity, and a sedentary lifestyle, and a high fat and high calorie diet that results in high blood cholesterol. Now, it's important to remember that the cholesterol levels are different in terms of targets for individuals with high risk. So individuals of high risk are those that have had a heart attack or stroke already. And in these, we want a tighter control of total cholesterol of less than 4 millimoles per litre, and the bad cholesterol, known as LDL, to be less than 1.8 millimoles per litre, compared to the general population where a total cholesterol target is less than 5.5 millimoles per litre. Now, diet is very important, and it's really important to control your portion size. It's not just about what you eat, but also how much of it you eat. And really important to eat a diet higher in vegetables and fruits. This gives you lots of antioxidants and good fiber and vitamins for your body. It also makes you fuller and helps you to avoid snacking on other foods that are less healthy, like chocolate and chips, for example. It's important to select whole grains and limit the unhealthy fats like saturated and trans fats. And it's important to choose low-fat protein sources like lean meat, poultry, and fish, and low-fat dairy products such as and eggs, which are really good sources of low-fat protein. And for example, things that you can do everyday life is trim the fatty cuts of meat off your dinner before you eat it. And it's important to limit or reduce your salt intake, because salt causes high blood pressure, which can ultimately cause increased risk of heart disease and heart failure. Exercise is also really important. We recommend everyone exercise for 30 minutes per day. Unfortunately, most Australians fail to meet this target. Now, exercise gets your heart pumping around your body and it lowers your blood pressure. It helps to strengthen your immune system, strengthens your muscles and improves balance, and helps improve sleep. Exercise also improves your mental health and well-being, and regulates your blood sugar and reduces your risk of type 2 diabetes, and contributes to a healthy weight. Now, regular exercise has been shown in numerous studies to reduce the risk of heart attacks. And in patients that have known coronary artery disease, for example, those who have had a previous heart attack, regular exercise is really vitally important. It's been shown to improve angina-free activity, prevents heart attacks from recurring, and decreases the death rate. And in patients that have heart failure, exercise has been shown to improve heart function and their quality of life as well. Now, I wanted to focus a little bit on investigations for coronary artery disease. So if you went to see your GP, they could do an ECG, which is an electrocardiogram, which is basically, it measures the electrical activity from your heart by putting surface electrodes on your chest. And this can tell us if you have conduction disease or if you have blockages in your heart arteries. It's a very simple and non-invasive test. We can do blood tests, including a troponin. Now, troponin is an enzyme that your heart releases when it's under stress. In particular, when you're having a heart attack, this enzyme will be elevated. You may get a transthoracic echo, which is an ultrasound looking at the heart pumping function and also the valve functions of your heart. A stress echo is commonly done for investigation of shortness of breath or chest pain. This can occur either on a treadmill or a stationary bike with or without medication. And it looks at the pumping function of the heart before and after exercise. And it helps us to identify areas of the heart that doesn't pump very well when there's increased demand from the exercise. And this helps us to estimate it helps us to identify where there may be blockages in your heart arteries. A CT coronary angiogram or a CT calcium score is commonly used for further investigation of coronary artery disease. The calcium score looks at how much calcium there is in the heart arteries. So a score between 100 to 300 means you have moderate plaque burden deposits in your heart arteries and you have an increased risk of heart attacks. And a score of greater than 300 is very high and increases your risk of having a heart attack. Now, the CT coronary angiogram looks at the actual flow of blood in your heart arteries and helps us identify blockages in the heart arteries before a heart attack occurs. So we can try and prevent that heart attack. Now, a coronary angiogram is the gold standard for identification of blockages in your heart arteries. These are performed in a cardiac catheterization laboratory at a hospital such as the Sydney Adventist Hospital. We insert a sheath, which is a hollow straw-like tube that sits in your groin artery or your radial wrist artery. And then through that, we inject some contrast through tubes that lead up to the heart and take some X-ray pictures as the contrast runs through the heart arteries to see if there's any narrowing or blockages. Now, if there are blockages, then we may be able to open up with a balloon and put in a stent, which is a little metal scaffold that holds the artery open. And that's called insertion of a coronary stent or percutaneous coronary intervention. Now, here at the Sydney Adventist Hospital, we're very lucky to have 3 cath labs available to do this procedure, and we actually have a 24-hour on-call roster. So if somebody comes in at any time of day or night with a heart attack, we'll open the cath lab and open up their blocked arteries to prevent their heart muscle from dying. Now, it is really important to do a heart health check. And the most important thing is knowing your risk factors. Now, don't wait for the chest pain to occur because it could be too late. Get the vital tests you need by visiting your doctor for a heart health check. So it's important to know your numbers. So know what your cholesterol is, what your blood pressure is, what your blood sugar is, and your waist circumference is. And it's important for females to discuss your pregnancy history because of the increased risk of heart disease if you've had complications during pregnancy. And know the warning signs. Heart attacks are not always what you think. And remember, the sooner you call 000 for an ambulance, the sooner treatment can start for you. And importantly for women, remember, women generally have fewer heart attacks than men. However, when they do, their outcomes tend to be worse, especially among younger women, because the signs may not be the typical left-sided chest pain and they are often dismissed. So these are my contact details. Since it's a webinar, we'll be taking questions at the end of all the talks. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Pennington, will be looking at the gut and how to keep the gut healthy. Dr. Pennington is an integrative GP committed to holistic lifestyle medicine that wherever possible seeks to use lifestyle as medicine to heal. He desires to use both traditional and natural remedies with sensible lifestyle measures to heal and promote wellness. Andrew is the founder and practice principal of the Sanctuary Lifestyle Clinic.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for having me on this talk. And my name is Dr. Andrew Pennington. I'm an integrative and lifestyle medicine GP, and I'm pleased to be a part of this presentation with Dr. Elizabeth Shaw and Associate Professor Ross Grant. I run a lifestyle medicine focused general practice called Sanctuary Lifestyle Clinic, and I have a strong interest in gut health. I thought I'd start off the talk today with just talking a little bit about what actually is the purpose of our gut. Well, I think most of us are aware that digestion is the main game for our gut, and that's a concept of breaking down the food into nutrients for absorption. But the gut does a lot more than just that. It also helps us to balance our water content along with the kidneys. There are various aspects of hormone production that it is involved in. It has an intimate relationship with the immune system. And clearly it's helpful in waste removal of toxins that are detoxified through the liver predominantly. And we're learning more and more that there are very strong connections between your gut and other organ systems of your body, including the brain, the heart, the skin, the immune system, the lung, lots of other places. So I thought I'd firstly start with a bit of a reviser for most of you who've done high school biology of the anatomy of the gut. And I'm sure we've seen these diagrams before, that the gut is an open tube essentially from the mouth all the way through to the anus. And the process starts here with when we chew our food, we start to release amylase from the salivary glands, which starts to break down the carbohydrate the food ends up down in the stomach, which then releases enzymes to try and break down different proteins. And then we end up having the food try and move out into the small bowel. The small bowel then pushes it down all the way to the junction here where we have the appendix and what we call the ileocecal junction. And then we have the large bowel, which is this part here of the bowel, which largely contains most of the bacteria in our digestive tract, and also has a strong role in water absorption. We also have we have organs that support the gastrointestinal tract, such as the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And these are all important in the process of digestion and its associated functions. Just having a little closer look as well as what we call the histology, which is, I guess, a microscopic look as to what the bowel actually looks like. And if we took the bowel here as a muscular tube, and then we cut a little section in it, as you can see here, and opened up to look at what's inside, we would see these circular folds here. And they, on the end of them, they have these little processes like fingers, which we call villi. And the villi essentially is the absorptive surface as to where the nutrients are going to absorb from digestion through into eventually into the blood supply, the blood or lymphatic supply. And you can see here that there's a number of different cells, and there's a few. Mostly we have what we call enterocytes, which have an absorptive function, and then there are some goblet cells here which secrete mucus. So do the enterocytes actually, and then down in the intestinal crypt here we have some. Often have some cells that communicate with the immune system and secrete different hormones. And if we were to enlarge up a small portion of this, this is what it would look like. You would see all these tiny little extra finger projections on top called microvilli, which is, again, part of the absorptive surface, and it basically enhances the ability of absorption quite substantially. And we have these junctions or these barriers between the different cells. And if you looked at them under the microscope, this is what they would look like. These folds and then villi, and then this is an electron microscope showing these little tubular-like structures of microvilli, which is where the absorption is taking place. So what's actually required for normal bowel functioning? Well, I've listed a summary of a few things that we need for the bowel to work correctly. Firstly, of course, you have to have a good machinery. The tract needs to be undamaged. It needs to be ready to go. And basically, you want your bowel undamaged, essentially. There needs to be an appropriate pH. That is how acid areas are in the right places of the bowel. And this is because enzyme function is determined by pH in various places of the bowel, and it's an important concept that's needed for normal bowel function. We need to have the right enzymes, and enzymes are basically things that help catalyze reactions in the body of breaking down different substances, and we need to have them predominantly. They come from the pancreas, but there are other enzymes that also we talked about earlier can come from salivary glands, and also it can be present already on the existing surface of the small bowel lining. We need bile to help us to absorb and emulsify fat, and we need bacteria. Quite interestingly, we need a lot of them, and most of them are in the large bowel, but we do have some in the small bowel as well. We also need the bowel to be able to push its contents from top to bottom, and so that's what motility is about, and that's determined through nervous function and smooth muscle and the associated physiology around that. We also need an immune system because the bowel is an open tube from here to here, and there could be any manner of hostile things coming through, and the immune system needs to be able to neutralize any threats. And of course, what goes through? Our food and fluid, and that we need to have a good diet, and especially fiber, which assist the bowel to do its normal functioning. So that being said, are there things that damage or hinder the bowel function and its microbiota? Well, absolutely. Unfortunately, top of the list is the Western style of diet. And we know that, unfortunately, our diets are ending up with too much refined products, high in sugar, high in salt, high in refined carbohydrates, high in animal products, and very low in fibre and whole foods. And this causes a raft of problems, but one of them is the production of trimethylamine oxide. And we're just discovering that this kind of chemical is associated with damage to the bowel and associated with different processes like heart disease and cancers. There are medications that can help, that can damage and hinder the bowel, in particular antibiotics, which have a role. Obviously, they're important when they're needed, but they can damage the gut bacteria, in some cases irreparably. That's one medication. Proton pump inhibitor drugs. Some of you may know these as reflux medications like Losec or Nexium or Somac. And these medications change the pH of the stomach. And although there may be a reason for that to be done, we really don't want people on these medications any longer than they need to be, because it changes the pH dramatically, and that has downstream effects to the enzyme function in the bowel and how proteins are digested, and then how that affects the different bacteria downstream as to what they feed on. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Nurofen and Voltaren, again, although they may be necessary temporarily, they can hinder the bowel function, and other things like chemotherapy drugs can also do the same. We've also learned emulsifiers can damage the protective layer of the mucus in our gut, and unfortunately there are a number of emulsifiers that are added into foods, particularly processed foods. Chemicals and pesticides are also able to damage the gut, in particularly glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and this is increasingly becoming a concern. Alcohol damages the gut lining and is generally not good for the bowel at all. And also, interestingly, stress. And I guess we all know that gut feeling when we get stressed. Absolutely, it does have an effect on the gut microbiota and the gut lining. So as part of this, I want to introduce a concept to you. Some of you may have heard of this. It's colloquially referred to as leaky gut, but more correctly, intestinal permeability. And to explain what this concept means, I'm going to use the example over here of the normal gut, as you can see. And we can see here that although it's a schematic representation, it gives us a little look at what the gut may be like. Here are some of these gut cells, and they have the little microvilli processes on the top, and they're held tightly together with what we call a junctional complex. And these have tight junctions, adherent junctions, and desmosomes. And these processes keep these cells really tight because you don't want things absorbing through that are not supposed to be there. You only want to control exactly what's absorbed. And as you can see here, the cells have secreted a mucus lining that lines on top here, but on top or in this mucus lining is the good bacteria, and there's a number of them, and different food particles that are just digested, some toxins. They're usually kept out by this mucus lining. Now, when this process gets damaged, this is what we call leaky gut or intestinal permeability, and it's represented across here where the mucus lining is degraded and there is an opening of these tight junctions or junctional complexes that may allow some of these larger proteins or viruses or bacteria to actually come through, sometimes straight through the middle and sometimes through the pathway of the cell, and they end up in the blood supply underneath, and also what we call the lamina propria just below the epithelial lining, and that's where a lot of our immune cells lie, and they will mount an immune response to some of these different things that can come through, and this can cause an inflammation. And the inflammation may be transferred through the body, and we can see effects of this kind of thing in other parts of the body. Probably the best example of this is celiac disease. And as I've mentioned here, it's leaky gut is associated with a number of diseases, but celiac disease is genetically determined, and it is a response to gluten or gliadin, and the body unfortunately mounts an immune response. It attacks its own cells, it destroys it even further, and it just perpetuates this intestinal permeability problem. And we know that celiac disease has many manifestations outside of the gut, including joint issues, neurocognitive and psychiatric issues. So that's probably the classic case. But we also know, and we're starting to learn, that it is associated with autoimmune diseases. Of course, celiac is one of those. Multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, and inflammatory arthritis are all starting to be understood as having something to do with damage to the gut lining and the function of the microbiota and immune interaction. And so really this leads us to a concept of disease, in that in autoimmune diseases, there are really three keys as to how somebody is going to develop an autoimmune disease. One generally needs to have genetic susceptibility, and this is still being worked out. In celiac, we understand very well how that happens. Then there needs to be the disrupted barrier function, as we're just showing here, and then the ability of bacteria or food substance or toxins to interact with the immune system and trigger an immune response. And that's how we believe autoimmune diseases are likely to develop. So what helps promote a healthy bowel? Well, the formula here is prebiotics plus probiotics equals postbiotics. Really what that means is that the right things we give in our diet are prebiotics, and probiotics are the good bacteria. They feed off them and they produce for us some helpful substances, what we call short-chain fatty acids. So a well-fed and well-balanced microbiota produces good things for us. And this is predominantly due to high fiber, because the fiber is really for those bacteria. And so if we can have a high fiber diet, we can include lots of different types of fiber in our diet. It's very likely that that's going to be very beneficial for our bowel function. If we can avoid some of the chemicals we're talking about that damages the gut, that will be very helpful. If we can improve our stress, if we can improve exercise and drink plenty of water, all of these things promote gut health. There's also an amino acid glutamine, which is helpful for bowel health. Just want to talk about the importance of fiber. We know that it is associated with a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, and many other diseases. There are different types of fiber, broadly speaking, insoluble, soluble, and resistant starch. And in practice, it doesn't really matter because many of these things are combined in different whole foods, plant foods that is. We should really aim for around 30 grams of fiber per day, 25 if you're a woman, 30 if you're a man, so pretty much 30 for both of us really. And more is quite okay. Whole or complete foods contain many of the important phytonutrients as well. So as you can see by that beautiful picture there are lots of different colourful plants there, and each of those colours usually represent a different phytonutrient, which is helpful for our body in some way. Fibre, as we mentioned, is designed for our bacteria. They produce short-chain fatty acids, which we're going to talk about in a sec. And I've listed a little website from the US government, which gives you a resource to check on different fibre content of different foods. Short-chain fatty acids. These are what we call postbiotics, and they are a byproduct that the gut bacteria produce for us when they are fed the right prebiotics, that is fibre, predominantly. Three are well known: butyrate, propionate, and acetate. They're the most commonly known. And butyrate is probably the one that's best known for its anti-inflammatory properties. So mostly when you produce it, it's used as a fuel source for the cells, but it also does many, many other things. It can also travel, it can be diffused into the bloodstream, and it can travel around, including to places like the brain, where it can be anti-inflammatory in those areas. Some of the metabolic effects I've listed here in this diagram, courtesy of this research paper. And you can see here that it improves insulin signaling in your muscle. It improves fat metabolism and the way sugar is managed in fat. It can reduce permeability in the gut. So it actually can help repair the gut if it's been damaged. It improves cholesterol management, and it improves the pancreas management of different hormone systems there, and it improves our blood vessel health. And so just talking a little bit about blue zones, which are the places around the world where people live long. I think this has been mentioned previously for those who might have been to a previous talk with Dr. Elliot Roach. But you can see there's about 5 or 6 areas around the world that are areas where people live long and healthy lives. The 3 best studied are Okinawa in Japan, Sardinia in Italy, and Loma Linda in California, United States. And you can see they share in here a number of things, but a plant-based diet is one of the most key elements of these long-living cultures. And so it's very, very pertinent to know this, because good gut health from plant-based diets usually equates to a longer life on average. So in summary, prebiotics plus probiotics equal postbiotics. That's the short-chain fatty acids we were talking about. And a healthy plant-based diet fuels your gut and produces beneficial byproducts for your body. You can choose a wide variety of plant foods, assuming you can tolerate them, and that will generally be very good for you. And we know that when the gut is healthy, the rest of the body tends to be healthy too, including, of course, the brain and heart that we're talking about today. Here is some recommending reading if you would like to. Fibre Fueled or Food as Medicine. Both of these books are excellent books to give you information about the importance of fibre and good quality plant-based diets.
Thank you, Dr. Pennington. The next presentation will be delivered by myself. I'm a clinical biochemist and biochemical pharmacologist and head of the Australasian Health Research Institute here at Sydney Adventist Hospital. Over the past 2 decades, our research team have published over 100 academic publications on how a person's range of lifestyle factors drives a person's biochemistry to either health or disease. In particular, we focused on the influence of the constellation of lifestyle factors and immune functions like oxidative stress and neurodegenerative disease. I'll be presenting on the relationship between our heart, as Dr. Shaw had given significant detail, the gut with Dr. Pennington, and then ultimately how that relates to the brain, and the importance of keeping these 3 talking together nicely for our ultimate health. So our gut, brain and heart, how do we keep them talking together nicely? Just let's get our heads in the right space to begin with. We've got an absolutely magnificent physiology overall, and the brain is the pinnacle of all of that. So when we have a look, we've got 86 billion neurons, and then we think each one of those neurons can be connected to up to 1,000 different other neurons within there. So we've got trillions of connections. All of them, we're hoping, are going to be able to be connected in ways that help us to do things that we need to do, think the way we need to do, act the way we need to do, and keep our body functioning well. It's interesting that 2% of the body weight makes up the brain, or the brain makes up 2% of the body weight, and yet it uses up 20% of the oxygen. What that means is that the brain is probably around about 10 times metabolically more active than other tissue. It weighs about 1.5 kilos, not particularly much. In fact, it has the consistency of about a soft tofu. 75% of it's water in its native state. If you take all of that water out, it's about 60% fat when it's dry. So, amazing piece of machinery. And it's protected from the rest of the body by what's called the blood-brain barrier, and that just means that things that are happening in the rest of the body, hopefully, particularly some of the negative things, it's got to be filtered before they can actually get into the brain. And so we've got this network of beautiful tight junction cells around the blood vessels so that only select things are allowed to come through into the brain. That keeps the brain healthy. So a healthy brain, what does it need to do? It's important for how you feel, we all know that. How well you think. If your brain's not working well, you don't work well. And how efficiently the body's organs operate, because the brain is the one that actually coordinates how all of these things put together. As we'll see a little bit later on, the heart and the gut both have lots of neurons in them. Some people call them the second and third brains within the body. But they themselves aren't acting independently. In fact, they're gathering information from their particular sphere of influence, sending it back to the brain, and then receiving information as to what to do from the brain. So what happens when the brain doesn't work well? Well, I'll go through this fairly simply, but obviously we're going to have slowed thinking and our understanding, and that can happen at any age. I mean, anybody who's had a lack of sleep knows that regardless of their age, they don't think so well the next day. Poor memory, poor decisions. Ultimately, if the brain, particularly the frontal lobes, aren't working well, they can't access good information. Ultimately, our decisions are going to depend on healthy acting brain. It can predispose us to things like depression, and we'll talk a little more about that, anxiety, and ultimately, potentially neurodegenerative changes within the brain where we're actually losing neurons, they're dying, and the resulting dementia as a result. So in order to keep the brain healthy and to work well, what do we need to keep it working well? Again, fairly simply. Well, best off if we can order a well-made brain. We don't have much choice in that. But there are a number of events around it, and certainly with the next generation we can. There are things that can happen in utero and certainly early life that will affect the ability of the brain to grow and develop. And just keeping in mind that the brain itself, particularly the frontal lobes, aren't fully mature until probably the mid-20s. Early 20s possibly for girls, mid-20s probably for the males. But there's a lot of things that will affect the wiring of the brain and ultimately its development. And we've got to be very careful that we're not going to throw things in there that are going to affect that development. It needs a good supply of oxygen. We'll talk more about that later on. But obviously, if it's using up 20% of the oxygen in the body that you breathe in, it needs a huge amount of oxygen. Needs to get a good supply of fuel, that's the generating of energy. Needs a good supply of nutrients. The brain itself, as I said, is a privileged organ that's, one of two things. It's not getting everything. It's got to make a lot of things in the brain. So it can't get everything just from the blood supply and having it made by other tissues. It's got to make a lot of its own neurochemicals itself and structural components. Now, we know it needs positive stimulation. People who are deprived of mental stimulation end up with a number of serious psychological and physical disorders. So we need to positively stimulate it. And ideally, we want to limit some of those negative stresses and stimulation. I won't be talking a lot about those today. That would be something somebody else will talk about. I'll be focusing mostly on the biochemistry of the brain. It needs also to be able to get rid of waste. Now, any tissue of the body produces waste, and the brain is no exception. And in fact, it gets rid of a lot of that waste, even though I won't be talking about sleep in this talk. But sleep is actually the time when you actually get rid of it. And in fact, there's a whole lot of flushing that goes on during sleep. So you do need to get that good quality, 7 to 8 hours, ideally, of sleep a night. And you don't want to put anything into it that's going to cause damage. And these can be like chemical toxins. They might be microbes, which can include viruses, bacteria, fungus, and then other biological toxins as well, including advanced glycation end products. This is actually coming from fried foods. Again, not a topic that I can go into in great detail, but this happens when you actually get sugars reacting with proteins. So the things that will increase these advanced glycation end products, and just remember that AGEs, that's the acronym, age you, and they'll certainly age the brain, and they are considered a significant promoter of neurodegenerative changes within the brain. But that's when you have sugars and proteins reacting together. It's called a Maillard reaction, and that can happen for two reasons. Either you've got sugars and proteins together under high heat, which is often with the frying, or you actually have high sugars that are floating around. Of course, people who have high simple sugar intake always end up with a sugar spike, even if they don't have diabetes, which is why there's a strong link between diabetes, high sugar intake, and the dementias. And then inflammatory activity, again, linked through to the viruses, bacteria, etc. And free radicals, again, won't have time to really talk about lots of those, but these are rogue chemicals that are produced when we possibly eat things that we shouldn't and get a bit of stress, and possibly with inflammatory activity, that type of thing. So poor mental health, we know it can occur at any age, and Australia actually has quite a burden. 1 in 5, that's 20% of Australians aged 16 to 85 experience a mental illness, that is a depression or anxiety, in any 1 year. That's huge. The onset of mental illness, typically around the mid to late adolescence, and Australian youth, 18 to 24-year-olds, have the highest prevalence of mental illness than any other age group. In fact, we did a little bit of a study in this that we published a few years ago in a cross-sectional study from adolescents attending 10 schools in the northern Sydney Central Coast region. We found 6% of boys and 9% of girls showed signs of severe to extremely severe depression. Now, we looked at some of the details sitting in behind that, but certainly high anxiety was related to it. Sleep played a significant role, and again, omega-3s played a role, which I won't have time to talk about this evening, but certainly played a role because of the way they're necessary, probably both for structural elements with the brain and synaptic signaling, particularly during this growth phase within adolescence, but then potentially also related to some of its modulation of inflammation which goes on in the brain. Degenerative brain diseases, we know that that increases with age. Around about 460,000 people are currently living with dementia, and notice that close to 28,000 are living with younger onset dementia, which is anybody under the age of 65. A huge burden in our society. So how does the brain achieve all that it needs for health, and does it work alone? And that, I guess, is the focus of our presentation, of my presentation this evening, is particularly its relationship to the gut and to the heart. So positive stimulation, as I mentioned, some of those positive psychological effects and the psychosocial elements, I'm not going to be covering tonight. It's a good topic for another time. I won't also be talking about the limited stress and negative stimulation, which can cause remodeling of the brain through various pathways. That again is a topic for another time. What I do want to focus on is some of the things related to the nutrition that the brain needs and its fuel supply. So obviously, if we're going to get anything into the brain, it's got to come via the gut. Now, Dr. Pennington has already spoken about the gut, and I know there's some terrific information there. What I want to be able to do is just give a little overview again of the gut and put it particularly in the context of how it helps the brain. So the gut, mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, 100 million neurons. It's the largest number of neurons outside the brain. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later on. But again, those neurons themselves aren't themselves directly linked through conscious thought. What they are doing is signaling and sensing what's going on in the gut, what's coming into the gut, how the bacteria are producing different molecules, and sending those signals back to the brain, which then sends them back to the gut in order to respond in different ways. So the jobs of the gut, basically the gut nourishes and protects us. That's the important role that it plays. It sterilizes our food, it digests and assimilates those nutrients. I mean, absolutely brilliant the way it does that, all the way from the way we chew the food, enzymes that are introduced from there down into the gut, the low pH and the acid that's there, ultimately more enzymes being added a little bit after that, and then the way it assimilates and separates things, so we get our amino acids, from proteins, and our different vitamins and minerals, etc., as well as our carbohydrates. So it helps to fight diseases and educates the immune system, particularly important, particularly when people are young. Contains around about 3.8 by 10 to the 13 bacteria, which is huge, and it's about the same number of cells that are in the human body. Gut bacteria, mostly in the large intestine, weigh around about 200 grams. So it's a really important part of the body, and as we're finding out, particularly these bacteria, the gut microbiome, also play a significantly relevant role to health within the body itself, and Dr. Pennington mentioned quite a bit of information about that. So, important point out of this, we can't get good things into the gut unless we put them, or into the brain, sorry. So we can't get good things into the brain unless we put them into the gut. Current research demonstrates that the importance of a healthy gut microbiota for patients suffering from anxiety, depression, as dysbiosis, in other words, a discomfort within the gut and a deregulation of some of the balance of different bugs that are in the gut, and inflammation related to the gut have been linked to potential causes of mental illness. And there's a number of papers on that now. In a recent paper, dysregulation of the healthy gut microbiome increases the risk of dementia, independent of other traditional source risk factors. So we need to keep a healthy gut in order to have a healthy brain, both in our mood, depression, anxiety, etc., as well as how that predisposes us to the development of dementia, in other words, loss of mental function and cognitive function. So good supply of nutrients, good supply of fuel, the gut's got to give us that. We also want to make sure that we don't put damaging things into the gut, and I've mentioned already about a number of those. I'd just like to throw in here, particularly in a developing brain, and as I mentioned, the brain develops from the back through to the front, and the frontal lobes themselves are not ending up with, the frontal lobes don't fully develop until early to mid-20s. And I do wonder sometimes, particularly about children who, in this age group, who are taking alcohol specifically, and other drugs, but also potentially even caffeine. And I know we've got a culture which has significantly embraced caffeine in a much higher level in recent decades. And I do wonder whether or not, because it does change the plasticity of the brain, does have effects on the blood flow and vasculature in the brain, whether or not that's a positive thing or not. But coming into the next part, good supply of oxygen is what the brain needs, as I mentioned. Uses up 20% of the oxygen we breathe in, while it's only 2% of the body weight, so it needs a good supply of oxygen. And it needs an efficient waste removal system. Both of these are actually facilitated by the heart. So we've got a link with the gut, now we've got a link with the heart. How does that work? So the heart basically, as Dr. Shaw would have mentioned, it's basically a pump. The heart and blood vessels, they enable the transport of the oxygen and nutrients around the body and the removal of some of those waste products. So it sends blood by the veins and arteries around the body, delivers oxygen, nutrients, removes byproducts like carbon dioxide, other metabolites, delivers immune cells to damage or infected tissue. And to do that, the heart needs to be able to do a couple of things. It's got to be able to respond to the physical needs of the tissue. And again, it's not something that I'll go into detail there, but absolutely amazing organ, being able to increase, decrease heart rate in response to a number of the changing physiological needs throughout the day. The circulatory and vascular system needs to remain free of obstruction and be flexible to allow the heart to achieve its objectives. So Dr. Shaw would have talked about some of the problems of blood vessel disease and how that can affect our health. Well, it will certainly affect the ability of the brain to receive things like oxygen and remove some of those toxic buildups if it's being clogged. And an incredible network of arteries and veins within the central nervous system, within the brain itself. Some of them very small, easy for them to get clogged, and also if the blood pressure goes high, easy for them to burst. So again, something else that you don't want to see happening within the brain. Now the heart is around about 40,000 nerve cells to keep it, to help it sense and respond to the body's changing needs. Again, the heart's not sensing things from outside you. It's not actually making decisions as to, if your heart gives a bit of a flutter when you see somebody. It's not that the heart has actually identified who that person was. It's actually that the brain identified it and then sent signals through, and we'll talk about the sympathetic and the vagal nervous system a little bit later on. But through that connection with the brain, it actually has a feeling which you then respond to. So what about the heart-brain connection? Well, dementia, as I mentioned, prevalent in Australia, second leading cause of death in Australia, and women are almost twice as likely as men to die from dementia. In 2019 study observed that the incidence of dementia in late life is greater than threefold higher in those people, that's men and women, who have poor cardiovascular health in midlife. So if you want to give yourself a greater than threefold reduced risk of getting dementia as you get older, get healthy, and particular cardiovascular fitness in midlife. A further study, 2018, in Swedish women, this is a longitudinal study, 44-year follow-up, found that a high cardiovascular fitness in midlife was associated with a greater than tenfold in these women, greater than tenfold decreased risk of dementia in later life. Amazing. So just being physically fit in midlife will actually set you up for a significantly reduced risk in later life. So the brain needs a good supply of oxygen and nutrients. It's the heart and the gut that are both providing those. So how do you keep your arteries open? Again, I don't want to go into this too much because a lot of this has been mentioned already, but avoiding eating things that stick to your arteries, saturated fats, trans fats, and particularly high sugars as well, increasing inflammation, sugars and fats, and these create all sorts of reactions which build up that atherosclerotic plaque on the one hand, or the calcification which will stiffen the arteries on in another way, which then predisposes to high blood pressure, etc. We've got most of that information. It's been fairly consistent down through the years. It really is something that we need to put into practice. And what you do want to include is foods that reduce inflammation, coloured plants, which provides things like, and this is the greens, oranges, reds, all of those colours. You want to get as much of that into the diet as you can, and if I little plug for green plants, as much as you can. Almost certainly for 90% of the population, it'll be a lot more than you think you need. And the interesting thing is, with all of those plants, they will give you things like nitrates, which are terrific ways of being able to produce some of those molecules in the blood that help to relax the blood vessels, which ultimately is like with nitric oxide. But what's interesting is that the gut microbiome, particularly in the mouth, a healthy microbiome is necessary to convert those nitrates into nitrites, which the body then uses to produce its nitric oxide. So really important to have a healthy microbiome all the way from the mouth through to the gut. And the types of foods promote that. If you take lots of greens and things, not only do they produce the nitrates, but they also give the fibres which the healthy bugs live on. Daily physical activity, and we know how important that is. So brain and gut. Brain needs lots of oxygen, talked about that. Lungs and hearts in good condition, they're the ones that supply it. But also needs lots of nutrients, energy, amino acids, essential fats, and I've mentioned omega-3s briefly, but also omega-6s. Maybe I can answer some of those questions if you have them in question time. Needs minerals like zinc, magnesium, calcium, copper, and iron. And it can only get those from the gut if the gut can supply it. So if the gut's not supplying it, in other words, if you're not eating it, the brain doesn't get it. The brain also benefits from molecules that's produced by the gut microbiota. I'll cover that a little bit later on. So the microbiota only kept in healthy balance by what foods you provide to nourish it. Now, Dr. Pennington has covered some of this, but I'm just putting it in the context of how brain and gut work together. So the brain is very dependent on the health of the gut. So the head brain is needed for integrating information from the internal and external environments. It gets its signals from everything. It's the one that interacts with the external environment in a complex way. The gut, and it has a gut brain, but that receives information for what's going on in the gut itself, sends it back to the brain, and then the brain sends information through to the gut how to respond. And then same sort of thing with the heart, again, needed for distributing oxygen and other necessary communication signals around the body, and it's getting its information from, you know, the blood pressure in the heart and blood pressure in different vessels and concentration of different electrolytes, etc. And then that signals back to the brain signals back to the heart, essentially what to do mostly. There is a little bit of autonomic activity that happens in both, but a lot of the communication is going back through to the brain. So how do the brain, heart and gut communicate, and does it affect our health? Well, of course it does. And the brain and heart intimately connected through what we call the vagus nerve. Now there are other connections. There's a few things that come in there in relation to things like soluble chemicals, hormones, and some of the small molecules even produced by microbiota. But main connections are through this. It's called the vagus nerve, though one comes either side of the neck and connects through with the heart and the gut. So the heart brain, 40,000 nerve cells that gather information about vascular resistance in the blood vessel, arteries, etc. The body's metabolic demands increases or decreases the heart output accordingly. Now, if it's sympathetic, in other words, if you get a stress response, something that kind of arcs you up, and that happens all the time during the day in small levels, and that's a positive thing. That tends to send signals that can excite the heart directly, can affect the blood vessels directly, but also send signals through to the adrenal glands on top of the kidney, producing some of those fight and flight hormones, what they call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis hormone, adrenaline, noradrenaline. All of these help to increase cardiac output, get you ready for whatever the challenge is. Hopefully it decreases fairly soon, and the vagus nerve is the one which actually slows and relaxes things. So the vagus nerve, again coming from the brain, a little bit further down in the bottom part of the brain, and helps to slow things down within the heart. So hopefully you've got a strong vagus nerve, so even though you might get stimulated with something, fairly quickly, parasympathetic activity through the vagus nerve can slow things down again, so you're back to a nice, comfortable, relaxed state. So you need balanced communication, not too much sympathetic activity, that's that stress activity, but hopefully get it balanced nicely by a strong parasympathetic or vagal de-stress signal. And of course you need to keep the arteries open in order to make sure that the blood flow and the nutrients. The vagus nerve plays an essential role in the gut-brain communication. It's able to sense the microbiome metabolites, transfers that information through the brain, which then generates an adapted response. So stress inhibits the vagus nerve and has, unfortunately, detrimental effects on the gut and its microbiota. A strong parasympathetic, strong vagal nerve activity can actually override that and reduce that stress response. But if the sympathetic or the stress response is too strong, that can predispose to diseases of the gut and, unfortunately, the brain also. This is just a little diagram showing that sort of thing. So the stress response from adrenocorticotropic hormone, corticotropin releasing factor, adrenocorticotropic hormone, down through to the adrenals, production of these stress hormones decreases gut motility, which is not something that generally you want because it reduces, unfortunately, the transit time through the gut, increases inflammation potentially as a result of that. We know that there's an increase in gut permeability, so things that should stay in the gut, we know there's lots of bugs and things you don't want in the rest of the body. The permeability of the gut, those cells lining the gut can get affected, and so ultimately you may end up with things leaking across that you shouldn't. And unfortunately, reduced blood flow into the gut, decreased mucosal secretion, so again, protection of the gut is reduced, and as a result of that, unfortunately, you can also predisposed to inflammation within the gut itself. And you get a decrease in some of those healthy bacteria like the lactobacillus and an increase in some of those bugs like the Clostridia, which is going to create some problems. Again, increased Campylobacter, Citrobacter increases, it's been linked with an increase in anxiety. If we can get the vagus nerve working well, reduces that stress response, helps to relax the gut, increases its ability, its in transit time. And one of the things that will help here is making sure that we get good food into the gut, because good food equals good bacteria. And I'll show a little bit more about it a little bit later on, but things like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, they decrease anxiety, but they've got to live on things that are, and particularly the plant fibers, very important for them. So the more of those we get, the more they've got to live off, the higher the concentration of them within the gut. So good bugs help to decrease inflammation, also produces good things like some of the neurotransmitters, the feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin, GABA, which is one of those neurotransmitters which actually help to reduce excitatory activity, and it does get across the blood-brain barrier. So it is important that even as a source of GABA within the central nervous system, and some other catecholamines which are important. So improves some of the other nutrients that the body takes in, tryptophan metabolites, which vitamin B3 and tryptophan itself, which is actually necessary for the production of things like serotonin, etc. And the short-chain fatty acids, which themselves are anti-inflammatory, they improve fasting blood sugars, and they actually, these short-chain fatty acids produced by the good bacteria are actually used for energy by the cells lining the gut. So very important to get good bugs in producing some of these good molecules like short-chain fatty acids. And unfortunately, the mental and cognitive health problems associated with a bad gut, it has been linked, as I mentioned earlier, to depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline, leading ultimately to dementia. So good food for good gut, though Dr. Pennington has mentioned some of these. Lactobacillus, the gamma and the short-chain fatty acids. These can come with so plant fibers, particularly veggie protein and fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, all increase lactobacillus. Unfortunately, the high saturated fats and animal proteins decrease lactobacillus, and it's because those proteins and the fats are actually different types of bugs feed off those different types of things, and they're more the putrefaciens type, similar ones to actually what decays the fats in animals, etc. So they will decrease the concentration of lactobacillus because there's more substrate around for some of those other types of bacteria. Saccharin, unfortunately, the artificial sweetener, decreases lactobacillus. For the bifido, the anti-inflammatory and the short-chain fatty acids, good bacteria to have. Apples, artichokes, blueberries, almonds, pistachio. Essentially, again, all of those whole food, plant-based. So another way of increasing vagus nerve activity, exercise. Great way of increasing vagal nerve activity and decreasing stress, been known for quite a long time. And depending on your age range, good to have a talk to an exercise professional there, just to get the right balance of exercise for you, particularly if there's any other health issues. But just getting up and moving almost in any way is always positive. Breathing deeply through the diaphragm, also another important way of being able to stimulate the vagus nerve, just because of the way the physiology is set up. And tie that in, because that breathing, also singing and humming, activates muscles that stimulate the vagus nerve. So not a bad thing if you're doing it around home. Many people get it during church activity. Listening to music, particularly Mozart, it has a calming effect, and particularly with Mozart, seems to increase vagal tone. Cold stimulation on the face and neck, so getting up in the morning and splashing that face with cold water has been shown to increase the tone of the vagus nerve. So it is a positive thing after all. We do feel better. And good gut bacteria, as I've mentioned, particularly things like lactobacillus, can promote that significantly as well. So bottom line is, what's good for the heart is good for the gut and is good for the brain. They do all work together. So the key points: the brain, the chief executive, receives and sends information to its two key managing directors in the heart and the gut. A healthy brain dependent on a healthy heart. A healthy heart and brain need a healthy gut. You can't get fed with good things unless good things are coming in and distributed. So to keep all three communicating well, we need to cultivate healthy attitudes, healthy diet, and healthy movement. So health comes from a balance of all three.